Hi, I'm Jean Shafiroff, and I'm on a mission. Anyone can be a philanthropist. My television show came from my book, Successful Philanthropy, How to Make a Life by What You Give. Won't you join me? Welcome to Successful Philanthropy. I'm your host, Jean Shafiroff, and this show is designed to highlight the work of philanthropic leaders here in the United States and then beyond. With us today, a very special man. His name, Governor David Paterson. And for all of you who don't know much about David, well, he was our governor in the state of New York from 2008 to 2011. He did a wonderful job, and he is a very civic-minded individual, someone involved in philanthropy, an all-round wonderful person. David, thank you very much for joining us. And David, I always like to start with a little bit about you, and tell me, what was it like back in 2008 when you took over after Eliot Spitzer left as governor? Eliot Spitzer involved in a sex scandal. All of a sudden, you became governor of the state. What was that like for you?
It was sort of like jumping out of a plane without a parachute. So on March 10th, 2008, I was in Albany, and because the lieutenant governor, which is my position, is on the third floor, all the governor's staff were on the second floor, so I didn't notice that none of the governor's staff came to work that day, as if it was, a national holiday or something. But my staff started to figure out something was going wrong, and they asked me to go to a family planning event in place of the governor, which I did. And then they asked me to go to meet with the Pope and all of the bishops, not the Pope, I'm sorry, the Cardinal, and all of the bishops. And I explained to them that that's a head of state to head of state meeting, and a lieutenant governor should never be in there. That would be as if Queen of England comes to see the president and the president wants to send the vice president. And they said to me, well, why don't you go anyway? And I said to myself, I'm the only one that knows protocol around here. Well, I was not the only one that knew protocol, but I was the only one that didn't know that the governor's going to resign at 2:15, and I'm going to be the governor, not overnight, but within a matter of an hour. So yes, it was a little shocking. My father, who I called, encouraged me to call all the state leaders, and I called them all. And the first one to call back was Senator Hillary Clinton. She, at the time, was in a primary with Senator Barack Obama. And she said, yeah, I'm busy, but there was something ominous about your message, David. What's the matter? And I said, I'm going to be sworn in about a half an hour. And she said, oh my God, what happened? I said, no, the governor's fine, but he's going to resign. And she said, well, David, why is he going to resign? And I'm pondering, how do you explain a sex scandal to Hillary Clinton?
And how did you? Or you said nothing?
I told her, and there was a long pause, and she said, oh, what a world. And I'll never forget that.
And when you took over as governor, did you feel prepared?
Well, not really, because the lieutenant governor is not really included in a lot of the activities that the governor does. Now, Eliot Spitzer, I've got to say this, gave me a lot of responsibility in the areas of energy, of domestic violence prevention, minority and women's business opportunities. And so he definitely gave me some areas, but in terms of the budget process and also many of the other duties of the governor, I don't think anybody is prepared when they come into office that quickly. So it was quite a learning curve. And also, I didn't always recognize all the governor's staff. The governor had about 200 staff members. I was at a reception 2 weeks after I became governor, and somebody came up to me and made this suggestion. I thought it was a great idea. And I said, listen, I'd like to learn more about this. Give me your card. I want to give it to one of my staff members. And the person said, Governor, I am one of your staff members. And I'm just standing there like, well, just checking to make sure you knew that. It was, that part was difficult. But what really was intense was that 2 days after I become governor, the budget director meets with me and shares with me that the governor's budget, which called for a 5.3% interest in spending in 2008, 2009, was totally inappropriate that the governor had agreed on that budget based on his need to make nice with the legislative leaders, but that the reality was that we were probably going to become billions of dollars in debt. And that came true to an extent that we wound up $21.3 billion in deficit that year. That was more than twice the highest previous budget deficit. And it was the largest increase in a budget deficit experienced by a state in the history of our country. So,
and how did you handle that? How did you handle that?
What I did was, anybody who knew a way to reduce that deficit, I listened to them. The conservatives said, cut healthcare and education, and I did that. And the progressives said, raise taxes, and I did that. And any of the revenue generating opportunities that the state had, I did that. So in a sense, I unified the state in passing the budget. But the way I unified them is the one thing they all agreed on was they were annoyed with me.
They were annoyed with you, and that's because you were attempting to balance the budget. Interesting.
Well, what happens is 10 years later, everybody tells you, it was great that you did that. It was great that you stood up to all of us. But they don't tell you that at the time. So it's very difficult to go on. I must have been the victim of about $11 million of TV ads, to the point when I watched these TV ads, when they were over, I didn't like myself.
Well, I doubt that. But anyway, you actually came into office during a great recession in the history of this country. And so that must have been very, very difficult. And of course, you had these budget deficits. And can you tell us a little bit like what it was to be governor during a great recession?
Well, it was very difficult because, in spite of the fact that there was this recession, it was a little different than the pandemic, where everyone has to wear masks and everybody has to stay indoors and the restaurants close. So in day-to-day life, things look the same. And I think a lot of legislators decided that I was overestimating the problem. And the Democrats felt that I was overestimating the problem. And the Republicans thought that I was underestimating the revenues that would come in. Now, both of them knew that that wasn't true, but this was the way that they tried to keep their constituents and also their special interests on the table. And finally, I guess around November or December of that year, when they started to see themselves how horrible a situation it was, we got everyone to come to the table. And oddly enough, in spite of the fact that this $21.3 billion deficit existed, we passed the budget on time.
Which is amazing and great. Right now, we're in the middle of a terrible pandemic, and you started to make reference to the COVID-19 pandemic. If you were governor now, how would you do things differently? Or would you?
I don't think I would do things much differently than the way the governor did. One thing he did that I never thought to do, and I don't know who was the first one to do it, but he started doing these daily briefings on the problem. And I think at first he and the other nationwide leaders, even the president, was doing a daily briefing for a while. It was almost considered like just their opportunity to communicate to large audiences. But I think over time, people recognized that they really needed to hear over and over what a menace the coronavirus has been and how deadly it is. And I was shocked that in this country, that this was not believed in all quarters. And in many respects, the attempt to get people to quarantine, to get people to wash their hands, to get people to wear masks, to get people to practice social distancing did not go over that well, almost to the point where people who were advocating it were accused of lying. And I thought we must really have had something invidious that has happened in our population for people to be reacting that way. And I think now that the second wave of the virus is overcoming us and we have mutations of the virus in South Africa and Great Britain, you're not seeing all these people standing up now and saying it's a hoax, it's not true, we're at the end of it, it's going away. We don't have to hear that anymore. People realize it's very serious. It would appear now, looking at it today, that in a few months, if we get 75 to 80% of the people vaccinated, that we'll be able to move past it but I thought that the governor of this state, really imposed a very well orchestrated um, closing and reduction of services to meet the needs of the healthcare of the people of the state.
Yes, and I remember the daily briefings, and I thought they were very helpful at the time. And as I look back, I still think that the governor's daily briefings were very important during this pandemic, and continually telling people to wash their hands, wear a mask, and social distance. That being said, we had many groups that ignored those rules, but as we continue in this pandemic, we all know how important it is to continue following these laws of washing hands, social distancing, and then wearing a mask. And as we look forward, what do you see? Do you see that we'll be wearing masks in 2022 and 2023? Or do you think this vaccine is going to eradicate this COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, we don't know if the vaccine is like the vaccine that you might take for the measles or the mumps or chickenpox, where you have one vaccine, or tetanus, where you have one vaccine and it basically covers you for life. Then we have vaccines for the flu, which sometimes have been less than 10% effective, and they do not relate at all to the type of flu that may exist in the following year. So we have yet to really learn that. We'll probably come to that understanding at the end of the summer and into the fall, which is apparently when the second wave of the virus hit us, and just hope and pray that there isn't a third wave.
Yes, and with all the food insecurity that we are experiencing in the United States and how it's truly affecting young children, in our country, 1 out of 3 children lives at or below the poverty level. And I think in New York City, it's the same, and perhaps in the state. Are we doing enough now in this city? In this state and in this country, or do we need to have more programs for those that are truly suffering?
Well, a little while back when President Biden was sworn into office, we're about a third the way through his idea to have 100 million vaccinations in 100 days. I think the horrible situation is the number of people who are starving in this country, because we create enough food to feed the whole world. We just have to find a way to keep it on our borders and feed the people who really need it. I think that we're doing the best we can, but I think that the virus overwhelmed us because of a lack of leadership at the executive levels of this country, and almost a scorn for the idea that anyone should even raise that we should do something about it. And I think against that backdrop, that the current leadership, and I mean Republicans and Democrats, have finally gotten really serious about eradicating this virus.
And we need to be serious. And now, Governor Paterson, I want to talk a little bit about your background and your family. I understand your father was in politics and you followed in his footsteps. Is that correct?
My father was the first African American vice chair of the National Democratic Committee. He was deputy mayor to Mayor Ed Koch, and he was Secretary of State under Hugh Carey, and he worked for a well-known law firm on Long Island known as Meyer Swazi. I myself grew up in Long Island. I represented Harlem and the Upper West Side and Washington Heights in the legislature. But Jean, the reason that I grew up in Hempstead, Long Island, is because in 1959, when I was school age, the New York City public school system would not put a blind student in the classroom with the other students. So you had to go to Lavelle School for the Blind or some specialized place. And though my mother thought that many of those institutions were very good at teaching reading and writing and arithmetic, she felt that school is more than that. And she explained to me years later that the people that you go to school with are going to be the people that you socialize with, and inevitably they're going to be the people that you do business with. Without that foresight by my mom, over 60 years ago, I don't think I'd be sitting here talking to you, Jean, because my friends who I was in programs for the blind at the time, my friends, some of them I'm still in touch with, none of them, in my opinion, reached the level of where their ability should have taken them, probably because they were isolated too much from society.
Well, your mom was a very smart woman, and so was your father, and they raised a very smart man, Governor Paterson. And Governor Paterson, I understand right now that you're not in government any longer, and that you're working with a group in Las Vegas. Is that correct?
Right now, I work for the Las Vegas Sands Corporation, who would like to bid for one of the 3 downstate uh, casino licenses. And, you know, usually I used to go into casinos, my whole life, and I would get a roll of quarters and put it in my pocket. And people would ask me why I did that. And I told them because we had a coin laundry in the basement of my building, and that's what I wanted it for. But what I really see it for New York State is a tremendous opportunity for job creation, for construction, because they're going to have to build these facilities, and also for revenues. The revenue licenses cost $500 million a piece. So if the governor settles on 3 licensed groups, that will be $1.5 billion. And then it will extend the revenue generating from about $300 to $900 million a year. And right now, as we're trying to recover from a pandemic, in the absence of Amazon, which that deal didn't work out over a year ago, we're going to, I think, see some new opportunities, not just for people to get jobs, but for some people who don't want to go to college or can't afford it to get jobs early on that turn into careers, as has happened in the casinos that the Sands owns in Las Vegas, and the other casino companies provide that as well.
Yes, and then I believe you had a Wall Street career in between working as governor and then working for this Las Vegas group. Is that correct?
Yes, Jean, I worked with your husband alongside him, Marty, at Stiefel, Nicholas and Company. I basically took a dare from a dear friend of mine who I wound up marrying to take the Series 7 securities exam. And with her help, I was able to pass it and learned a lot about finance and a lot about the way investment banking works and the different mechanisms that people can use to expand their personal wealth, and also the ways that governments can avoid some of the problems that existed back in 2008 in the financial market. And I'm so happy that I did that, because it gave me a portal into an area that I didn't really know that much about. And now I'm happy to say that I wish I'd known a lot more about finance when I was governor.
And my husband has fond memories of working with you. I think you were on the other side of the floor, but
Yes.
he would tell me a few stories. He really doesn't talk about his business, but he did tell me you were there. And it's nice to have you as a friend, Governor Paterson. And
Well, I'll tell you one quick story. I came in once on a Saturday, and I'm in the office. I thought by myself, and then I heard a dog barking outside the door to my office, and that was Marty and your dog.
I believe it. My husband works nonstop, and we do love dogs. And we right now have 5 rescue dogs. Getting back to you, Governor Paterson, you are married to a lovely woman, Mary, and this is a second marriage for both of you. And what are your plans moving forward in terms of career? Or do you think you'll stay in the world of Las Vegas, or do you think you'll create a new career? And would you ever go back into politics?
I don't think I would go back into politics, because it is a very rigorous career, particularly at the level that I attained. About 3 weeks after I left the governor's office in 2011, I got on the elevator in my apartment building, and this guy got on the elevator and he said to me, "Thank God it's Friday." And we're riding up on the elevator, and I thought to myself, wow, I guess he's right. It's Friday. I don't have to do anything. Friday is usually the day before the 2 days I work on the weekend. And so I think it's just too rigorous. And then it compounds any kind of problem with family. I mean, choosing sometimes between political events and graduations, and and the younger people, when you have kids, and I have three of them, they don't always understand that you have to do other things, and you don't always understand why you're doing it. So I don't think I would do it in that end. But right now, I'll stay with the Sands as long as they'll have me. I love working with them. I work for a lobbying firm, Kivett, as well. I do some teaching at Touro College here in New York, and then I do some consulting, privately for people who would like to get my advice on certain things. So I'm really enjoying my life these days. It'll just be a lot better when you can go to restaurants more. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. I think we all miss the restaurants in New York City, and hopefully this spring they'll all start to open up again, because it's been very difficult for all of our small businesses this pandemic. Now, talking about race relations, and do you think that we are moving forward now? And do you think that the difficulties that we've had with the horrific history of slavery in our country, and then segregation, and then of course we had the greatness of Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, but do you think we are actually moving forward now?
Well, let's start with Martin Luther King, since you brought him up. He was once in New York, and his next speaking engagement was in Boston. He was driving, they believe, on the Merritt Parkway with his group that he traveled with, and they felt they were lost, and they saw a police car. They kind of went over and waved to him. The policeman stopped, and they said to him, we're trying to get to Boston. And the officer said to them, you're going to have to go back before you go forward. And Dr. King loved the way the officer said that, and then worked it into a speech that he made in Boston that evening. And that's how I feel about America. America is a great country. We've done things that other countries have never achieved. We have probably, our Constitution rates among the great legal documents of governments, even including the Magna Carta. It's that great. But we also have another problem. We've never really accounted for what we did to the people that lived in this country when we were the illegal aliens coming in the 14th, the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. We've never atoned for 244 years of slavery or another 92 years of legalized segregation. In any great person or in any great entity or even a government, you have to do some of the things that Germany did after World War II to totally tell the people of their country that Adolf Hitler did not speak for all Germans. We have to not do what Japan did after they attacked China in World War II, never apologizing. And we're now 80 years after that attack in 1939. Contrition is really the way to a better world. And sacrifice, as we all know in our religious studies, is always the prelude to forgiveness. And I don't understand why we don't do it more. Instead of tearing down statues, I'd like to build a statue to the slaves who built this country and put it right in Washington, D.C., between the Lincoln and Washington monuments, because they did as much as Lincoln or Washington did to make this country as great as it is. But we keep getting this resistance. And what bothered me about the attack on January 6th in the Capitol is that all of a sudden, all those people who are always talking about the police and how we have to keep them safe, they didn't care. In fact, they were attacking the police. And the second thing about it is some of them were wearing red shirts, which was the symbol of the opposition to the freedom of slaves that went on in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, and culminated in the only overthrow of a government in this country in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1896, where the number of African-American males, because women didn't have the right to vote, fell from 125,000 in 1896 to 6,300 in 1898. So if we don't want to repeat these perils of history, I suggest we have to show some atonement for our mistakes of the past.
No question. And I think that anyone who is racist is really, they're wrong, and we have to fight racism in this country. I like the idea of the statue of the slaves put in Washington in a strategic location. I think that would be great. Now I want to speak a little bit about you and your philanthropy. Our audience, we are with Governor Paterson. We're just about ending this interview. Governor Paterson, I know you have a sight impairment and that you're legally blind. Is there a charity that works with the blind that you particularly like and that you want to discuss in the next 1 minute?
Well, I've always loved the National Federation of the Blind, but I am the chair of Achilles, which is the running organization for all disabled groups. It's achillesinternational.com, and the Achilles gives people who have disabilities the opportunity. If you're blind, you run with a tether and you run with a sighted runner, or if you're deaf, you can run with other runners that can, in sign language, tell you how far you have to go. And I love working for all those organizations and raising money for them. And thank you, Jean, for the opportunity to actually discuss that.
And you are an extraordinary man. And many people forget that when you are in politics, you are really giving your life. And as Governor Paterson said early, that you can't really have a life. It's very difficult to have a life outside of politics because politics has to come first. The state of New York had to come first, and unfortunately, his family had to come second. Of course, he's a very good father, but it's a tough thing to do both. And Governor Paterson, we have about 30 seconds. If you'd like to leave our audience with one thought, what would that be?
The thought is that we'll never walk as brothers on this planet until we look at each other and realize that we are brothers and sisters. Until then, we're all asleep. That would be the awakening for this country and the world, and I sure hope I live to see it.
And I can't agree with you more. Thank you so much, Governor Paterson, for joining us. This concludes Successful Philanthropy. I'm your host, Jean Shafiroff. I'll see you next week.